Hello, my name is William Villano. I'm an archivist at the Center of Sacramento History. I'm here today with Dr. Lorena Márquez, professor of Chicana and Chicana Studies at the University of California, Davis, and we'll be talking about her upcoming book, La Gente. Dr. Márquez, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am originally from Galt. I was born in Lodi, so I'm fairly native to this region, and I teach at UC Davis, as you mentioned, in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, and I teach Chicano and Chicana history there.
Wonderful. So, I understand that this is of a personal interest to you. Could you dive into that a little bit more? What makes topics such as Mexican-American civil rights just so interesting to you that you devote your life to studying it and writing books on it?
Yes. So as a young undergrad at Sacramento State University, I was exposed to a lot of Chicano movement elders and activists, many of whom I came into contact with when we were organizing against Proposition 187, which was an anti-immigration legislation backed by then Republican Governor Pete Wilson. And I learned a lot from the Chicano movement elders. Many of them were of retiring age or nearing retirement. And so I knew that there was a history there. And part of my interest in the 1960s in particular, I think, stemmed from my own activism and my own experience in organizing and wanting to learn more about this history. And also, I think being from the region and being an undergraduate student who was majoring in history and not having one book on Chicanas or Chicanos in the Sacramento region really made me feel like there was a tremendous void and a need for this research. And my goal became, as an undergrad, to put Sacramento on the map.
Wonderful. And in your focus on Sacramento's Mexican-American community, you did something that not a lot of historians did. You shifted the focus kind of from the major civil rights leaders, the kind of standard bearers, and you shifted it to more rank-and-file, average, everyday person who you titled La Gente. Could you tell us about La Gente, not only who they are, but their importance, and really why you decided to focus on that aspect of the Mexican-American community?
Yes. So La Gente I define as the working poor, both migrant and settled residents of Sacramento, immigrant and undocumented as well, women and men, mostly working class folks who were everyday people, what folks call everyday people. I wanted to focus on La Gente because I felt like there was much more to the Chicano movement historiography than had been unfolded or told in terms of moving beyond organizations, well-known leaders, mostly male leaders, well-known events. I wanted to focus on what was happening in local neighborhoods or barrios. And I wanted to really look at how people internalized the Chicano movement. How did they see themselves up against the movement? Were they part of the movement? Was it something different? And my project then tells that story from the lens of the people.
We all know that the struggle for civil rights didn't start in the 1960s. It obviously had a background and context. Could you dive into that a little bit, just so we know where it's all starting?
Yes, I think it's really important for all of us to remember that activism, or what I also call resistance in my book, had very early beginnings. Organizations were developed as a form of combating, for instance, racism in community. Folks needed to find other like-minded, other folks who had experienced many of the things that they had experienced both in the U.S. and abroad. There were organizations already in Sacramento, such as mutual aid societies or mutualistas. I'm thinking here of La Alianza Hispanoamericana. And we also had the organization of women through Las Madres Mexicanas de Guerra, which were the Mexican war mothers, who were organized around really their children, their sons who had gone off to war in World War II. They served as, I think, a bridge between the community and these war heroes, as they called them. And then we also had the establishment of the Community Service Organization in the 1950s through Cesar Chavez and Fred Ross, and the establishment of MAPA, which is the Mexican-American Political Association. So all of these organizations together predate the Chicano movement. I think it's important for us to remember that it wasn't like the 1960s came and all of a sudden people are like awoke and are organizing and are fighting for civil rights. This is a part of a long trajectory.
And now, with that long trajectory that had been building, there were the obvious parallels to the rest of the civil rights movement, Native Americans, African Americans. Would you just briefly touch on how the Chicana movement really played into the times and to the parallel struggles that were happening?
Yes. So I think it's important to credit the African American civil rights movement in particular that had really ventured into like the national political landscape by the 1950s, starting all the way back to Rosa Parks and the passing of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, which eliminated segregation in public schools. There was all of this activity already on the ground in the American South, launched mostly by African American civil rights leaders. And Chicanos, I think, saw this momentum that had already really come to ground by the 1950s and early 60s. And they saw themselves reflected in many of the stories told by African Americans. And I'm talking here about oppression, racial oppression, and this idea of being a second-class citizen, that the color of your skin and your aesthetic and the way that you're perceived has always been a detriment for people of color to advance. And I think Chicanos and Chicanas saw themselves reflected in the struggles of African Americans. And they were inspired, like many folks all across the nation, including Asian Americans and Native Americans, were inspired by the civil rights struggles of African Americans. And I think the fact that most folks by the late 1960s had television sets, which was once a very rare commodity in American households, especially American working class households. By the late 1960s, television sets were almost in every American household, and folks were able to see firsthand the civil rights movement and must have been just so completely in awe of the efforts of African Americans. And I found in my work here in Sacramento that indeed Chicano movement activists were very much looking to African American civil rights leaders and were inspired. And I think that they mimicked many of their tactics.
Now, building on that, the kind of parallel struggles, there was one of the interesting things that you dive into in your book is not only these struggles of race, but also struggles within the movement as well. Sometimes the everyday person on the ground wouldn't always agree with what the civil rights leaders wanted, expected, or were even generally pushing for. The very powerful story that you dive into and devote an entire chapter to is the Washington School in Midtown Sacramento, just outside of the Alkali Flats neighborhood. Could you tell us about how they essentially shocked everyone?
In 1964, the NAACP Sacramento branch sues the Sacramento City Unified School District on grounds that they had not fulfilled the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. And they win their lawsuit, and Sacramento City Unified School District begins to dismantle first African American schools, and they prolong the dismantling or desegregation of what they call Mexican schools, schools with large Mexican student populations. And the reason that they sort of hold off on these so-called Mexican schools is because they see it as a larger problem because of language. And so in 1968, the school board moves to desegregate Washington Elementary School, really fulfilling the court ruling, right? The mandate, their court mandated to desegregate. And to just the surprise of Sacramento City Unified School Board members, and to the surprise of Mexican American leaders, many of whom had advocated for desegregation, ethnic Mexican parents resist desegregation efforts. They do not want Washington Elementary School desegregated. And so this completely floored everybody, because the logic was then, and probably still is now, that segregation or keeping schools with one ethnic group as a majority is a negative. And these Mexican parents were arguing that they wanted to keep the school intact because it offered cultural resources, because there was bilingual education, there was Spanish language staff, and they had cultural programs that were largely performed by the students for the parents. Washington Elementary also served as a sort of a really important location for folks to come together. In the evenings, English classes were offered, for instance, at Washington Elementary. And so it becomes sort of the focal point of the Washington barrio. And so to close down the school would mean to close down all of those rich cultural resources. And so the Mexican parents voted, like by 97% of them voted against desegregation. And this sort of plays out in a series of meetings and protests and boycotts, petitions and so forth that the parents advance. And unfortunately, they lose their battle to keep Washington Elementary School open. The school is actually destroyed. The children are bused to mostly white majority schools. I think the longest distance was something like 12 miles. So students were bused to and from that home, and it made for a longer school day for them. Parents felt felt like maybe their children would be unsafe at these other schools, that maybe they'd be, experience racial hostility or violence towards their children. So I think for me as a scholar, and everything that I had read in terms of efforts to desegregate, stretching as far back as the 1930s with the Lemon Grove case in 1931 in San Diego County, is that for as long as it's been documented, Mexican parents have always advocated for desegregation. So when I was here at the archives, actually, and I learned about this case, I was just like, how does this play into this sort of larger historical legacy of fighting against segregation? And here you have parents who want to keep their school segregated. What does that mean, and how does that fit into the 1960s? And so one of the things I argued is that the parents really wanted to be self-determined. and that self-determination for them meant to have autonomy and a say over their neighborhood school. And so whether you agree or disagree, with the benefits of desegregation, I think it's important for us to look at what the people on the ground are saying, the people who are the most affected. And of course, they were also asking for more resources, more funding, more skilled or better skilled teachers, for instance, was one of the demands that they had as well. So it wasn't like they were completely oblivious to the educational needs of their children. They just didn't think that closing the school was the right answer.
That's wonderful. I believe you used the term educational gerrymandering, which I found to be very powerful, saying that here's this one powerful block with a community, the school board will listen to the 90% Mexican-American community school, but if you split them all up and there's never more than 5-10% Mexican-Americans in a school, do they really have the voice to be heard? Can they really are they even capable of organizing on the same level as with Washington? And I found that to be one of the very powerful things where it's, you have this powerful struggle of racism and civil rights, but you also have the powerful struggle of self-determination, community identity, maintaining who you are and really charting your own course. And it didn't always work out too well. It wasn't a very smooth transition at times, and they did come to conflict.
Yeah, and I think also more relevant terms, I think we have found that there's this resurfacing of, they call it resegregation, like schools are now more racially segregated than they were in the 1950s, and some people are really alarmed with that. Like, how did that happen? Well, it continues because segregation follows class, right? So if you have, if communities of color are usually also are lacking economic resources or are in poor neighborhoods or underfunded neighborhoods, or then that is going to continue to mimic the neighborhood school, right? So what do we do now? I think is a good question to ask. Should we, desegregate, or do we start funneling money into these schools and have more community outreach and input, and have parents make more of the decisions? How do we run these schools effectively so that the students who are at these schools are actually benefiting? I think those are important questions to ask as well.
Now, one of the big topics that you really repeatedly touch on in your book about self-determination are the small resistances. You've told me that protesting can be a privilege. It's not always for everyone. A lot of the time, say, the Chicana mother may be at home and she still has children to feed and household duties to take care of. Can you touch on that a little bit, just saying that not everyone could be the person leading a march. Not everyone is even physically capable of marching, say, from Delano up to Sacramento.
Yes. So one of the things that I try to do in my book is to talk about activism in its multiple formats. The working poor don't necessarily have the time to leave their jobs to commit themselves to a movement. Not to say that that's never happened. I think it's important for us, for instance, to highlight the UFW Great Boycott that lasted 5 years. And here we're talking about farm workers. And so those instances do happen in history, and I think it's important for us to recognize them. But I think it's also important to recognize that not every single instance of resistance is going to manifest itself into a boycott that lasts 5 years, for instance. People make choices on a daily basis about how they want to interact in terms of a social movement. So for instance, if we're looking at the women in the Chicana movement, well, maybe they couldn't, attend a meeting, or they couldn't go to a rally, but on the weekends they helped raise funds by, making food and selling it for fundraising purposes. Maybe they housed some of the farm workers as they arrived in Sacramento. Maybe they leaflet. I mean, there's all these ways in which people organize, but yet we never recognize those individuals because those are seen as small acts. And so I think it's important for us to consider that resistance or activism isn't this full-fledged, in your face all the time, because that's not necessarily possible, especially for the working poor and especially for women.
It's very powerful when you realize that all of these small resistances actually probably make up the bulk of the movement, the ideological really power behind it, is that this is an everyday kind of struggle, and at times, yes, it does come to a head, and I feel that you're shifting focus from the major marches and events down to the everyday struggle really is one of the first times I've seen these stories told from the regular, average, everyday person. Because one of the things that really struck out to me is you do detail some of the cost of activism, particularly in the story of Ruben Reyes. Would you touch on that a little bit, just about everything that was happening with the cannery workers and then eventually the sacrifices that Reyes had to make for the struggle?
Ruben Reyes is a transplant from Arizona. He comes to Sacramento and immediately begins working in the canneries. He speaks English fluently. He was raised in Arizona. He was brought up in the public schools there. He's been exposed to segregation and racism in Arizona. It's very much a part of his history, his experience. He comes to Sacramento and he starts working in this canneries. He works at Libby. And he realizes very quickly that there's a lot of racism taking place at this cannery. And he learns that this racism has been in place for decades. And one of the things he notices, for instance, is that all the higher ranking positions are not given to Mexicans or African Americans, that those posts are held for whites only. He also notices that the local union, the cannery union, is also mostly white, and that African Americans and Mexicans are not part of the union structure. He also notices that the union, when there are worker complaints, those don't go very far because the union is in cahoots with the employer. He forms an organization or a union called the Cannery Workers Committee, and it is made up of Mexican Americans to represent a majority Mexican American workforce. And Reyes' story, I think, stands out not only because he was able to found a union to counter their supposed union, but also because he is the first to sue a cannery on the basis of discriminating against Mexican Americans and women. And he wins in 1971. And no one had ever been able to go against this sort of major industry, the canning industry in California, which was huge at the time. It sort of starts falling apart by the 1970s in terms of its economic power, but nevertheless, and this comes out of Sacramento. And it comes out of, to me, that's very telling. And Reyes considered himself a Chicano. He used the term. He was very aware about the Chicano movement, very well informed. If you look at the cannery workers, their newspaper, you'll see iconography of Chicano movement heroes such as Emiliano Zapata, Che Guevara is also in there. And he talks a lot about civil rights. He talks a lot about, I shouldn't say he, the Cannery Workers Committee in this newspaper, they bring a lot of the civil rights into their newspaper. And I think that is, who would have thought that cannery workers could be part of a movement, yet we don't know that story, right? And at the same time, of course, it makes complete sense. Like, they're not operating in a vacuum. Like, a lot of these stories, a lot of the claims to injustice make sense to them. Who more than they know about what it is to be discriminated against? They're the ones who live it daily, right? And so, to me, that's the excitement of that chapter, is that here we have people who you wouldn't, think that are part of a movement, and to me are very much part of the movement.
To me, one of the most powerful aspects of that chapter, you had one of the young men who ended up becoming the editor of the Cannery Workers Committee's newsletter. He actually writes in the first newsletter, "I'm sorry if this is poorly written. I've been working in a cannery for a decade, and it doesn't necessarily equip me to do this, but I still want to make that contribution. We still need to have our voices heard," even though he had no training, no education in this type of activism, even in writing or publishing. And it was just powerful to me to say, I'm not qualified for this at all, but it still needs to be done, and I'm the one here on the ground suffering. I have to do this.
Yes, it was like, it's been called upon me to write this newsletter. I don't know what I'm doing, but please bear with me. And that's exactly the beauty of it, right? Like, these aren't folks who are college educated. Not that they couldn't be college educated. It's just, they're working at a cannery, so it's not something you would expect to come out of a cannery. And I think also just to have the foresight. To have the foresight that if you have a newspaper that's bilingual, that everything is written both in Spanish and in English, and everything is detailed in there in terms of their rights and laws and these services and these federal agencies that can help them. Really telling them, for instance, about seniority, about how they can benefit from a decree, for instance, or to apply for a job, or any of those things. To have the foresight to say, this is how we're going to get the material out to the people, to la gente. This is how we're going to be distributing it. And to have such enormous success that the Cannery Workers Committee actually is the largest, most rapid in terms of members in Northern California. You have chapters in Vacaville, King City, all over Northern California. It becomes that big of a union and gains so much support. And then other folks are able to sue on the basis of discrimination and win.
And it really, to me, it really highlighted the racism of the time, where you not only have overt racism. I know you touch on some graffiti in the men's bathroom that was rather offensive, and you can contrast Reyes's display of, I believe it was Zapata,
yes,
with the overt racism that was shown in the bathroom, and just the completely different ways that they were treated. So you have that just very obvious racism, in addition to the kind of less known racism of suppression of information. There are federal rights, but the union, the Teamsters Union, would only display those rights in English and therefore make them inaccessible to most of their workers who only spoke Spanish. So these kind of two types of racism coming together to really suppress the masses who may not have had the resources, education, or experiences to be able to resist or to even really know that they had rights. So Ruben Reyes forms the Cannery Workers Committee, creates a union in order to sue not only his racist employer, but his own union that he's already a member of. One of the kind of tragedies of this is that that type of activism has a cost, an actual personal cost. Could you touch on that at all?
You mentioned the Emiliano Zapata poster. Emiliano Zapata is a Mexican revolutionary hero. Reyes has a poster of him on the wall, and he's asked to take it down. And he's asked to take it down because some cannery workers or some of his co-workers or were offended and, said it was racist or they didn't feel comfortable or something like that. And he's like, I'm not taking down the poster. Like, why am I going to take down the poster? It's my freedom, like, of expression. Like, it's my constitutional right to be able to express myself and to have this poster up. And he tells them, well, why don't you, paint over this this racist names that are on the walls and, paint it and whatever. So anyway, he gets sued. He gets fired for this. Well, he doesn't get fired, but he will eventually get fired. He gets laid off, and because he refuses to take down the poster. So he has legal representation, and he is forced to go on welfare. Well, he can't go on welfare because he is technically not fired. He's laid off, but he's not getting paid. But he has 7 children, and he needs to feed his family. And so the lawyer, Nathaniel Coley, prominent African-American civil rights lawyer in Sacramento, represents Ruben Reyes and finally is able to somehow maneuver to get him to get food stamps for his family so he can feed his family while he's laid off and not getting any payment. Long story short, Ruben Reyes eventually is fired from his job. Now he doesn't have any money to support his family. His divorce, he doesn't get, I don't know if he ever got legally divorced, but he separates from his wife. And, because of the stressors, according to him, according to his oral interview, because of the stressors of organizing, he says, my wife never understood why I was doing this. And, here I understand the wife, being homeless, having kids. I mean, that's not easy. And Ruben Reyes then separates from his wife, and he eventually ends up in a house that is virtually falling apart around him. And one of the very sort of telling moments of that interview, for me at least, a very moving moment, was when he talks about the house falling apart. And he goes, if you look around this house, this is pretty much what my life represents, right? That my life has fallen apart. And I was never able to recover from being fired. And to me, listening to Reyes, I mean, it's heartbreaking, but also it's a reminder that these are human beings who are connected to family members, who have their own families, who have their own friends, who have given up so much, and that organizing at the level of maybe a Ruben Reyes or organizing at the level of maybe a Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta comes at a personal cost, because that is time away from your family, that is money taken from your family, resources, and I think it's important for us to pause, right? And not only to celebrate these Chicano movement heroes or sheroes, or, I think it's important for us to think about that, that it does come at a cost.
And often that's a cost that a lot of these people aren't necessarily equipped to pay. They're not wealthy. Losing your job, if you're a banker in New York City, you're fine if you lose your job. You'll be okay. If you're working in a cannery and you lose your job, hard times are going to hit much quicker. So that really, to me, was the focus on the people on the ground, their own personal sacrifices and their own personal struggles for self-determination. I felt really one of the strengths of your work. Now, why do you think it is that this movement was really centered around the Sacramento area? Why not LA, San Diego, or Houston, Texas, or El Paso? What do you think really contributed to the groundswell of support in this region?
I actually think that this is probably happening in Los Angeles and San Diego, and I think it's happening everywhere. I think we just haven't really looked into it. I think that Sacramento, because of the state capital, you have a lot of imagery, a lot of remembrance, a lot of these huge marches that had never taken. You're actually witnessing it. You're not looking at it in TV. You know what I mean? It's like in your backyard. It's hard not to be swept up in that. And so I think that all of these things really gave way to the stories that come out in Sacramento. I think also that regardless of what's happening on the outside or how folks are looking at ethnic Mexicans in Sacramento, ethnic Mexicans see value in their community and see value in their barrios, and they see value in themselves. That, you know, speaking Spanish isn't necessarily a bad thing, that being Mexican isn't necessarily a bad thing, that being brown isn't necessarily a bad thing, and that that they're able to hold on to those things because they find them important enough to preserve and to celebrate. And so I don't want to say that these stories aren't happening maybe in San Diego, but maybe we haven't looked at canneries in San Diego. Maybe folks are talking about, you know, discrimination. I don't want to say that, you know, there aren't barrios that see this cultural wealth within their own enclaves. I think it's important for us to start to investigate, right, how everyday people are engaging the Chicano movement and how they're being informed and therefore are also expressing, you know, some of those, those feelings in very outward ways. I think we just need to look for it.
Interesting. Yeah, because like you said, there's very, very few works of literature out there on the La Gente, on the people on the ground. There's plenty of works on the Laura Suerte, Cesar Chavez, but the individuals marching with them they don't always make it into the history books. And you know, I don't know about you, but while I'm marching, I would like a little food in my stomach. So Abuela on the side of the road cooking up some food, she's very much part of the struggle because you can't protest in a vacuum. You can't be active by yourself. It has to be a community movement. Now, looking at community self-determination and identity, which is some of the major themes in your book, there was a very interesting episode that happened on the UC Davis campus with DQU. Could you touch on that one? Because I felt that was, to me, it was really La Gente taking the movement to another step of self-determination, not just maintaining their own, you know, culture and identity, but really striving for their own interpretation of further education at the college level. Could you dive into that a little?
The DQU case, I think, is unique because you have this moment in which Chicanos, mostly students, and faculty, and Native Americans are coming together for purposes of being self-determined, and they want to start a university or a college campus that will focus solely on Native American and Chicano issues. And Jack Forbes, who has since passed, he was a professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis. He envisioned that this university would one day come to pass. And he had begun to work with Native American scholars and activists at the Davis campus, and also Chicana and Chicano activists at the Davis campus. And so the site where DQU is founded becomes available. I want to say somewhere around 1971. And so they apply for It's a former communications army depot, and it's vast, and it has buildings that could easily be dubbed for like dorms for students to live there. There's already, people can teach in those, they have classroom sort of settings, and so it becomes ideal, this site. Well, UC Davis also puts in an application for the site because they want to experiment with monkeys. And so Davis, UC Davis, the university, and then you have the Chicano Native Americans who are coming together under the direction of Jack Forbes and David Risling. And they put in an application, and like a day or two before the application is due, it's announced in local media that UC Davis got the site, or the award for the site, was awarded the site, I'm sorry. And it was like, how are they awarded the site if we still haven't passed the due date, right? So
Yeah.
so then it becomes illegal that UC Davis is awarded the site. So the students come together and they decide that they are going to take over. And they set up teepees, and they take over the land for a series of months, and eventually they are awarded. And you have the founding of DQ University, which is a Chicano Native American community college. It becomes an accredited community college. And from 71 or 72 to 2005. Long-standing community college. A lot of folks don't know about it, but here you have a moment in which identity politics really takes ground, and Chicanas and Chicanos are arguing at this time that they are relatives of Native Americans, that they themselves are indigenous, that they themselves have been colonized by both Spanish and then the American governments, that they have also experienced land loss as Native Americans. And they sort of build this school based on these, quote, similarities. But there's a lot of internal rifts that happen based on these identity conflicts, and I guess also historical conflicts, right?
Sure.
That arise. But nevertheless, you have the founding of this university, which is, to me, the ultimate self-determined. To me, it stands out as the most self-determined moment in the book, where these students come together to fight for their own education on their own terms. So they have, everything is centered on Chicana and Chicano and Native American education, everything.
Yeah. And to me, it's really fascinating that they say, hey, we want to have this community college, we want to have this education. They get told no, and they just do it anyway. I mean, I could never imagine myself just going onto a college campus and starting my own university. It's just a fascinating lesson in self-determination and courage as well. Just to say, you know what, we're going to occupy an army depot and start our own university. To me, it's what Occupy Wall Street should have been, but 50 years before.
And to be successful.
Oh, that's...
For as long as it was. I think it's one of those moments in history where you're like, wow, they pulled it off. They really pulled it off. I mean, unfortunately, the school is no longer standing. It's no longer, but the site is still there. And it's a 1960s sort of civil rights phenomenon. And it's also takes place here in this area.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's what makes it also fascinating. There is no other university in the nation to date that I'm aware of that exists. That's a Chicano Native American college.
And really started by a groundswell of the students. And that's, to me, you have the people on the ground saying, this is what we want, and let's go get it. I've seen nothing like it anywhere else. It's really astounding to me. Would you just talk about the kind of path you took to create this book? I understand it's been a little over a decade, something of a life's work.
Yes, so I want to say it's 20 years because I want to take it back to undergrad, to that, as I started, I think our conversation today about how I was really motivated to document this history. And so as an undergrad, I had amazing professors, Professor Pitti, Joseph Pitti, and Charles Roberts, who trained me in the mechanics of archival research. I started looking at newspapers early on, and I just started tracking anything and everything on Mexicans. I looked at the Sacramento Bee and Sacramento Union. And then I went on to get a master's at Sac State in history, and my master's actually was on the desegregation case. I also, I call it my other master's thesis because it never, nothing ever happened with it, but I did a whole study on 1968 because that was a huge year in civil rights history. So I have all of that, and I also did a research paper on Cinco de Mayo celebrations in Sacramento. The first I found was in 1864, and the Battle of Puebla actually happened in 1862. Mm-hmm. So just 2 years later, Sacramento's celebrating Cinco de Mayo. So it was like a very long process. I spent, I want to say, 6 months here at the Center for Sacramento History, and I looked at all sorts of stuff. I looked at, there was a compilation of oral interviews that were conducted in 1983 by Rosana Madrid. Mm-hmm. I think it was called the MexicanAmerican Ethnic History Project or something like that.
Sacramento Ethnic History Survey, and it had a Mexican-American section, but they did cover every ethnicity we could find.
That's great. I love that. I want to say those were part of some of the efforts of Joseph Pitti at Sac State at the time. And then you had the Ruben Reyes collection. I didn't even know he existed until I came here, and voila, here comes my third chapter. I'm happy that at least I got the book out. It's my homage to Sacramento, to all the foot soldiers, to all of the activists, African American, Asian American, Native American, the Chicano activists who paved the way for people like myself. Without them, I wouldn't have a job in Chicano studies. I would not be teaching and loving what I do. It is because of somebody thinking that our history was worthwhile, that they preserved our history. It was for somebody to think, let me record these oral histories. It is because somebody said, let me donate my archives or my family pictures, that I am able to tell a story, fragmented, maybe incomplete, but at least there's a story, and it's here in Sacramento, and I accomplished finally what I set out to do. It feels really, really amazing.
Dr. Márquez, it's been wonderful speaking with you. I thank you not only for your kind words about the center, but your important contribution to American and Chicano history. Thank you, and to everyone at home who watched, thank you. Please look for the book coming out this fall.